Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congressman Jim Langevin, and I have the privilege of representing the 2nd Congressional District of Rhode Island. I'd like to start by congratulating this year's National Advocacy awardees, Sarah Carmody and Jenna Crafton. Advocacy drives change, and it's the tireless work of advocates like Sarah and Jenna that help make our society more accessible and inclusive to all. So thank you for everything that you do, and congratulations. So I also want to start by thanking the National Association of Counsels on Developmental Disabilities for inviting me to talk about some of the important work that's going on right now in Congress to improve the lives of people with disabilities. So when I was a teenager, I was seriously injured in an accidental shooting that left me paralyzed. So for me, this issue is deeply personal. As the first quadriplegic to ever serve in Congress, I understand the need to make our society more accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities. And throughout my career in public service, I have set this as one of my top priorities. In 2001, as a freshman member of the House, I founded the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus. The caucus serves as a space to inform, educate, and raise awareness in Congress among members and staff on the many issues that affect people with disabilities. So we've had a lot of success along the way here. In fact, the caucus has grown now over the years and now boasts more than 50 members. Now, one way that Congress effectively supports the disability community is by investing in programs that benefit people with disabilities. For example, state and territorial developmental disability councils receive substantial funding through the Administration for Community Living, whose annual funding is determined by Congress. So the Administration for Community Living also supports protection and advocacy systems for individuals with developmental disabilities, university centers for excellence in developmental disabilities, and projects of national significance in intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I understand how vital these programs are to the disabilities community, which is why I work closely with NACDD each year to secure substantial funding for them. Most recently, this past April, I led a bipartisan group of 30 members of the House to request strong support from the Appropriations Committee for these programs in fiscal year 2022. So I'm pleased to report that the House Appropriations Committee passed funding increases for all 4 of these programs in the Labor, Health, and Human Services Appropriations Bill. This bill will be taken up by the full House in the coming weeks, and I look forward to supporting it. Now, I'm going to work closely with my colleagues in the Senate to also make sure that we maintain strong support for these programs in the final appropriations package next year. So if you want to help in this process, I encourage you to contact your senators and let them know just how important these programs are for people with developmental disabilities. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for inviting me to speak, and I hope that all of you enjoy the remainder of the conference, and congratulations to our awardees. Thank you.
Welcome to day 2 of the National Association of Counsels on Developmental Disabilities Annual Conference. My name is Erin Prangley, and I am the Director of Policy at our Washington office. What a great video from Congressman Langevin. We are so lucky to have his support and the support of our congressional champions throughout Congress, including Senator Murphy on the Senate side, who heads up our appropriations request. These folks really do get what community living means, how inclusion and equity are so important for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. Yesterday, we heard from administration officials and leaders from our disability national groups about how much has been accomplished during the first few months of this year and how much more work needs to be done. Moving towards change, we're now turning to our second day and to look at how Congress and the states are focusing on the needs of people with disabilities and using the momentum from these elections to move forward with real changes for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. We'll hear from staff leaders in congressional offices about how they're creating a legislative roadmap that we need to make real and lasting change. So why is change happening now? COVID forces us all to see the consequences of ignoring the needs of people with disabilities, from severe isolation, lack of services, and sadly, greater infection and death rates in institutionalized settings. We know this is all because of our history of neglecting the rights of people with disabilities to live fully in the community. So such ignorance and inaction is simply not an option now, that we have the opportunity to move forward out of the pandemic and to take what we've learned about these inequities and to make it right. Another reason that there's change in the air is that we elect Congresspeople every 2 years. This is a nonpartisan thing. Our elections are by definition political, but we do see changes in our Congress every 2 years. So advocates in Washington are used to seeing changes. Change is what's constant in our lives every 2 years. Sometimes these changes are big and sometimes they're small, but this was a year of very big changes. First, we saw a new president elected who seems to clearly understand the needs of the disability community. He had an entire platform before he was elected that he's begun implementing, as you heard yesterday. But secondly, we see a real change in the party leadership in the Senate. So we see new faces in our Senate offices who have strong ties and history to disability advocacy movements. This is a great benefit to us because we don't have to go back in and start from point A. We have some real experts in disability that I'm happy to say are on our call today. With this historic leadership, we've already seen an intense interest in disability rights, equity, and inclusion. It's my pleasure to now turn this over to Nicole LeBlanc, a familiar advocate to many of us, who specializes in public policy and excels at communicating the needs of people with intellectual disabilities to public officials. She's been at the forefront of disability rights for years, working and consulting with TASH, Respectability, the DD Councils, and so many more advocates. It's my honor to turn this over to my friend Nicole. The floor is yours to introduce our panelists.
You agree? Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon on a nice summer day. There is a feeling in the air that now is the time to finally achieve real change for the better for people with disabilities. A new president and new Senate have elevated lifelong disability advocates and bright new staff to influential positions. It's my honor to introduce you to some of these top legislative staff who will talk about how they are creating legislative roadmaps to advance disability rights, equity, and inclusion. First, we'll hear from Amanda Lowe, Director of Disability Policy for the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Prior to working with Senator Murray's committee, Amanda advocated for the National PTA, Physical Therapy Association, I believe that is, and the National Disability Rights Network, and the National Association of State Directors of Special Education, NACDD. Amanda began her career as a special education teacher for students with emotional and behavioral disabilities. And do I keep going? Phoebe Ball joins us from the House Education and Labor Committee. Phoebe has spent her professional career working on issues relating to disability law. Phoebe also comes from the DD Act family, having served as a staff attorney with Disability Rights Florida for 7 years before she moved to the DC area to work for the National Council on Disability, NACDD. Alec Goldstone is a legislative assistant for our Capitol Hill champion, Jim Langevin. Alec's portfolio includes health disability policy, and he is also responsible for helping us with the annual appropriations requests for the DD councils. He also has experience in transportation, infrastructure, energy, environment, labor, and campaign finance reform. And last but not least, Kim Musheno rounds out our panel. Kim has spent over 25 years of experience working in DC on disability policy. She is the past chair of CCD, Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, the nation's largest national coalition of more than 100 disability organizations. Kim also co-chairs the Autism and Education Task Force, and she's also a rock star ally of the self-advocacy movement. I'll turn it over to you, Amanda. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. It is so nice to see you. And thank you to NACDD for inviting me here today to speak. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Amanda Lowe, and I am a Disability Policy Director on the Senate Health Committee. And on that committee, it is really my great honor to work with the various teams to help ensure that disability policy is meaningfully included throughout the various policies within health jurisdictions. So more specifically, I work with the health team, the education team, the labor team, and the pensions team. So obviously, disability policy is tremendously important for Chair Murray. And again, I'm just honored to be in this position. So Chair Murray has really, I think, been doing some exciting things in the disability space on the Help Committee. And I'd just like to give you kind of a brief overview of a few of the things and then talk more specifically about some of the work around HCBS and then back to school, as both those things are really, I think, top of mind right now. So you may have seen Chair Murray co-led the Keeping All Students Safe Act that was introduced earlier this year, or CASA. For those of us that have been advocates for a little while in the field, we have been working on CASA for many, many Congresses, and this is a really fantastic bill. The Assistive Technology Act just passed out of committee, the Help Committee earlier today, so that's exciting. There's work that's ongoing on a public health package that we're hoping to do a little bit more work on later this fall, so disability will be included in that. And then there's also work ongoing on the Education Sciences Reform Act, or ESRA, as it's sometimes called. And more specifically, I'm thinking about the National Center for Special Education Research. And just to sort of step back, ESRA created the Institutes for Education Sciences. So that's kind of the researchy vein. So anyways, needless to say, we've been super busy, and it's been great, important work. So I think from what I just heard, you all heard from Alison Barkoff yesterday, and some of the work that's going on in ACL. And I just would like to touch briefly on, I'm not sure if she did, on some of the work around HCBS that's been going on. So as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted the urgent need to ensure that all Americans have the option to receive quality long-term care in the setting that best meets their needs and preferences. This is nothing new, but again, I think the COVID-19 pandemic really kind of shone a bright light on this issue. We also know that the vast majority of Americans would prefer to receive services and supports at home. Indeed, today, over 3.5 million older adults and people with disabilities receive Medicaid HCBS. And although all states do provide some coverage for HCBS services, some states actually cap the number of individuals who may receive services. So we have a wait list currently of almost 820,000 Americans, which is devastating, really, right? And I think we saw the effects of that devastation throughout the past year and a half. President Biden's American Jobs Plan includes a historic $4 billion investment in Medicaid for home and community-based services. I think the importance of this cannot be overstated. These critical services will enable seniors and people with disabilities to remain in their homes, stay active in their communities, and lead independent lives. The president's proposal would expand access to good quality care, lead to better pay and benefits for workers. And the investment creates enhanced funding to strengthen long-term care today and for the future. And it builds upon the $12.7 billion short-term HCBS funding that passed as part of the American Rescue Plan. Chair Murray is proud to co-lead the Better Care, Better Jobs Act, which carries forth President Biden's vision and addresses the immediate and long-term needs of HCBS. So specifically, and I won't go too in the weeds on this, but specifically, the bill provides $100 million for states for HCBS infrastructure planning grants, enhances Medicaid funding for HCBS. So states would be eligible for a permanent 10% point increase that was seen in the American Rescue Plan. And it would strengthen and expand the HCBS workforce, show improvement over time by demonstrating improved availability of services, and comply with the strong maintenance of efforts for HCBS eligibility. And then states also may receive a 1-year 2% FMAP increase if they encourage innovative models that benefit direct care workers and care recipients. And also would make permanent spousal impoverishment protections and make permanent money follows the person. So needless to say, and I apologize for just spouting out all those words, but this is really just a tremendous opportunity that we have before us. And Chair Murray is committed to seeing this through. Now I'd like to go ahead and just touch quickly on sort of this idea of returning to school, right? We know the fall is incredibly not too far away, as we're actually on this third day of August. I cannot believe it. So Chair Murray has really helped to lead the charge to help ensure that schools have the resources they need to meet the crisis of COVID-19 head on and reopen safely. If you remember way back when, it seems like so long ago now, in June of 2020, Chair Murray introduced the Coronavirus Child Care and Education Relief Act. And that really has served for the framework for the education funding that we saw contained in the American Rescue Plan. So the American Rescue Plan, it passed in March of 2021, and it includes over $125 billion in K-12 funding. And that funding will help schools to reopen safely for in-person instruction as quickly as possible. And it provides them with sort of a laundry list of various different things. But a few of the things that I just wanted to highlight on departments, conducting activities to address the needs of students from low-income families, children with disabilities, English learners, racial and ethnic minorities, students experiencing homeless and foster care youth. Purchasing educational technology. Again, I think we've really come to the realization that educational technology is not a luxury, right? But it's a complete and utter necessity as we've moved to sort of these new ways of thinking about learning. Mental health services. Again, I think the past year has highlighted the importance of mental health services. Address learning loss. School facility repairs to reduce the risk of virus transmission, implementing activities to maintain the operation and continuity of services. So I just wanted to go through these things, these various issues, because Chair Murray has really, since I think the introduction of the Child Care and Education Relief Act that I mentioned before, has really fought tirelessly to have money included and resources allocated to states to ensure that schools can, in fact, reopen safely. Additionally, we've seen a bunch of guidance out of the Department of Education. So more specifically, we've seen two, and I may misstate the name of these, but the two COVID-19 handbooks that the department has published, and Chair Murray supports those. I think they've been helpful. She supports the efforts of the department to issue additional guidance as we really navigate these unusual and incredibly unique and challenging times. So that's some of the work that we've been doing on the Help Committee. But again, our goal and Chair Murray's goal on the committee is to really ensure that disability is just woven throughout all policies and not seen as anything separate from really, but rather a part of. So it has been my absolute pleasure to spend just a little bit of time with you today, giving you some of the highlights. I am around if I can ever be of assistance or a resource to you all as you do your important work. And thank you for allowing me the privilege to talk to you all a little bit today. And with that, I'm going to turn my time over to my friend and colleague, Phoebe Ball, who is Disability Counsel for the Education and Ed and Labor Committee. Phoebe?
Hi, thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you for stealing my thunder because we've been working on so many of the same things. Really appreciate you going through everything that the Help Committee's been working on, and just wanted to sort of echo some of what Amanda just said in terms of the critical importance of the Home and Community-Based Services, HCBS, funding that the Biden administration has proposed and that we are fully supporting. We held a hearing, as many of you may have seen, I guess it was week before last, on the direct care crisis that has been made so much worse through the COVID pandemic. Before COVID, there was a real crisis in terms of the turnover rates within the direct care workforce, difficulty retaining, difficulty recruiting direct care workers. And that also leads to, a reduction in quality of care for people with disabilities and for older folks, and also, frankly, to the long waiting lists that Amanda had referred to, because even if there's money available to provide the services, if people can't actually find folks to do the work that needs done, then it's not going to do any good. So we really need to make sure that this workforce is supported, and that they're available to provide those services, and that these are good paying jobs with good wages, good benefits, and that people really want to make a career out of. Because again, in terms of quality of the services provided and just the relationships, and many of you I'm sure already know this, but as a person with a disability myself, I know that those relationships with people who provide provide services, direct support to people with disabilities, are really critical. And if the direct care workers can't sort of make a living wage and have benefits that they need, then that relationship is not going to work, and it makes it more difficult for people with disabilities. So that's something we've really been working on through the introduction of the Direct Care Opportunity Act, and again, having that conversation, the hearing that we had a couple of weeks ago, to really talk about some of these issues in the direct care workforce, to really help build that understanding in Congress of how much these services mean to people with disabilities, and just supporting that $400 billion investment in home and community-based services. Another thing that we've been working on, that's very important, it actually does connect with the HCBS services, is the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act. And the reason I say it connects to HCBS services is some people don't realize, although I'm sure most folks here do, that home and community-based services includes employment supports that help people with disabilities engage in competitive integrated employment. And so another important initiative for Mr. Scott is the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act, which is a program that would phase out 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that allows employers to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage, or less than their non-disabled coworkers, or non-disabled workers in a similar field. Would phase out 14C over a approximately 4.5-year timeline, and also provide grant funding to states and to current 14C providers in states that don't get the grant. Kind of a complicated two-step there. But basically, it's as currently written, it's $300 million in investments over 5 years to help phase out 14C and help make sure that people with disabilities transitioning away from 14C have the competitive integrated employment opportunities that we'd like to see, and that they have all the supports and access to customized employment that they need to succeed. Pardon me, I'm losing my voice. I've done a lot of this today. Apologies. And additionally, that bill also makes a 25% investment increase in supported employment following the grants, after the states have successfully completed the grants. So that's something we're working on, and obviously having conversations with our friends on the Help Committee and with the administration about what that looks like, and what the future is for phasing out 14C, because that's something that is a very important initiative for the disability community, and something that we're working on. I also wanted to echo Amanda's comments about the importance of getting students back in school in person in the coming year, as school's about to start. And especially for students with disabilities. I don't know if you all saw it, but there was another report that came out today talking about students in Chicago, and how much students with disabilities in Chicago sort of lost in terms of implementation of their IEPs, and just the gaps that have widened for them because of COVID, and because of the complications of distance remote learning, and how difficult that was for a lot of students with disabilities. We had a hearing on that also back in March of this year, to talk specifically about the equity issues related to students with disabilities during COVID, and just to really examine what the challenges were that students with disabilities in particular faced during COVID, and what we need to do to make sure that those students have the supports that they need as school reopens. And as Amanda said, the American Rescue Plan had significant funding that included funding specifically for students with disabilities, and hopefully will help to ensure that those students really do get the services that they need. And obviously, in future funding, we're looking at getting to as close to full funding of IDEA as we can. Obviously, making sure that that funding is robust and that we are providing the services and supports to students with disabilities that they need, especially as they sort of face the challenge of getting back on track following COVID. And that's going to be a challenge for everybody, but definitely more so for students with disabilities. We're also working on a number of other initiatives that are related to things that I think folks will be interested in. The WIOA reauthorization is going forward. We're not actually looking at the Title IV portions, which are the vocational rehabilitation portions, but we are having a lot of internal conversations and conversations with our Republican colleagues, as it's a bipartisan effort, about ways that we might be able to improve WIOA so that it works better for job seekers with disabilities in general. We're also looking at, again, as Amanda said, the Assistive Technology Act. That's an effort we're going to be joining here too, because we want to make sure that people with disabilities have access to the assistive technology that enables them to continue working and to continue engaging with their communities. That's very important. And we also want to look at Ability One reform, which is something many of you may know about, which is a program that provides employment for people with disabilities and provides a contracting preference for federal contracting dollars to go to operations that employ people with disabilities. Currently, that has a 75% direct labor ratio, which means that people with disabilities, while they're paid, wages that are usually pretty good and certainly above minimum wage, but it's also sometimes can lead to segregated settings that they're employed in. So we're looking at ways to sort of think about how Ability One can better serve the needs of people with disabilities, but ensure that federal dollars are being used to ensure opportunities for competitive integrated employment for people with disabilities going forward. So those are some of the really important initiatives, kind of the focus of a lot of my work. As Amanda said, a lot of what I do too is just interacting with my colleagues. I've done some really important work on the FIPSA, which is the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, and making sure that meets the needs of people with disabilities, because as many of you know, people with disabilities unfortunately do face higher rates of domestic violence and other kinds of intimate partner violence than other populations, and sometimes don't get the services that they need because the systems aren't ready to respond because of particular needs they have related to their disability. So trying to make sure that legislation is more comprehensive of those things. And a lot of other sort of little initiatives that sort of get tucked into things. I was very happy to work on the Apprenticeship Act that we passed a while back, that we really made some improvements in the way that apprenticeships hopefully will deal with people with disabilities, and will make sure that they have meaningful opportunities to participate in apprenticeship programs, which are such an important pathway to employment for people with disabilities. So really working, across all of the different areas that we have jurisdiction over, and trying to make sure, as Amanda said, that people with disabilities are included in every single conversation, and making sure that their needs are met by all of the various areas of legislation that we have some influence over. So that's I'm nearing the end of my time, so I'm happy to introduce Alec Goldstone, who is sort of the new, I think of him as being relatively new, disability policy staffer for Representative Langevin, and plays a very important role in making sure that, again, people with disabilities are included in all of the legislative conversations on the Hill, with his role relating to the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus. So take it away, Alex, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Phoebe. And also thank you to Nicole for that introduction earlier on. So as Phoebe said, I'm Alec Goldstone, and I'm a legislative assistant for Congressman Jim Langevin. And specifically in his office, I handle the Congressman's disability and health portfolio. As Phoebe said, I'm rather new to this role, but I'm really glad to be here today and have this opportunity to share with you some of my boss's interesting work in this area. So, as you heard the Congressman say in his opening remarks, each year he works closely with NACDD to lead an appropriations letter that requests funding for 4 specific programs that really provide critical supports for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So, first of all, this includes federal funding for DD councils. And I'm not going to go into that because I think it's safe to say that everyone on this call understands their importance and that the federal funding goes towards helping to increase things like inclusive education, housing, transportation, and employment. So that's one element of the letter. It also requests funding for protection and advocacy for individuals with developmental disabilities, or PAD. And this helps to ensure that people with developmental and intellectual disabilities are protected from some horrible things like abuse, neglect, and in some cases, financial exploitation. Yet another thing this letter supports is funding for university centers for excellence in developmental disabilities. And these centers help with interdisciplinary training, technical assistance, and research. Lastly, the letter also supports projects of national significance in intellectual and developmental disabilities. And these projects generally collect and report data on costs, trends, and the status of several things like residential, in-home, and employment services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So, as I said before, each year, with support from NACDD, Congressman Langevin circulates a letter across the House, and he urges all his colleagues that he can possibly get to sign on to this to support these programs. And this year, back in April, the congressman circulated a letter requesting $85 million for DD councils, $45 million for PAD, $45 million for University Centers for Excellence, and $14 million for projects of national significance. And I had to say that thanks to the strong support of advocates and people in the community, as well as just our allies on Capitol Hill, we got 30 members of the House to sign on to this letter, and we submitted it to the House Appropriations Committee. And fortunately, the Appropriations Committee recommended funding increases for all 4 of these programs and even included them in the fiscal year 2022 Labor, Health, and Human Services Appropriations Bill. And this bill actually passed the House last week, including these funding increases, which we were really excited to see. The next step, however, is making sure that these funding increases make it through the Senate. And with that in mind, I really encourage all of you on this call to contact your senators and emphasize the importance of these programs. I mean, this is a bipartisan issue. People on both sides of the aisle understand the importance of these programs. And at this point, the House has affirmed its commitment for these funding increases, and it's important that we make that clear to the Senate. So I encourage you to do that going forward. I think now I'd just like to pivot and touch briefly on some of the other bills that Congressman Langevin has introduced this Congress. The first one that I'll talk about is the Disability Access to Transportation Act. We generally refer to this bill by its acronym, which is DATA, and it's a lot easier to say, to be completely honest. So Congressman Langevin introduced DATA with Congresswoman Dina Titus from Nevada, and Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey introduced a companion in the Senate. DATA would do several things to improve transportation for people with disabilities. For one thing, it would establish a one-stop paratransit pilot program, which would allow individuals to schedule an intermediate stop during their paratransit trips. And we think this is really important. We hear from so many people in the community who utilize paratransit, and they tell us that even when it's great, and even when it helps them get to where they need to go, there are often excessive wait times in between paratransit trips. And having to schedule multiple trips, line them up, it's a hassle scheduling wise, and it also just takes time out of your day that could otherwise be spent doing other important things. So DATA, for one thing, would establish a pilot program for a one-stop paratransit system. It would also require federal agencies to adopt the U.S. Access Board's currently proposed public rights-of-way accessibility guidelines, and it would adopt them and turn them into enforceable standards. These guidelines, they apply to pedestrian spaces in the public rights-of-way like streets, sidewalks, and crosswalks. And right now, I mean, these guidelines were proposed back in 2011 and 2013. It's been about a decade, and still, they're just guidelines. So Congressman Langevin's bill, DATA, would require the Department of Transportation and Department of Justice to adopt these and make them enforceable standards, which we think is very important. Additionally, DATA would increase funding for Section 5310 mobility grants, streamline a reporting process for accessibility complaints in transportation, and launch an accessibility data pilot program. I'll also add as a side note that most of data was actually included in the House's Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, and that actually passed the House back in early July. So we're excited that the House has supported this, has passed most of data's provisions. I'm going to move on. The next bill I'll talk about is the Congressman's Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. So as all of you probably know, the Air Carrier Access Act, which became law back in 1986, is the primary law that prohibits discrimination in air travel for people with disabilities on the basis of disability. So even though this law exists, even though we have this law, flying really isn't accessible. And making matters worse, it is so common for airlines to damage assistive devices during flights, during travel. We hear stories from people in the community, from the advocates we work on this bill with, who have told us just horrible experiences that they have with traveling. And for example, one anecdote was someone who was supposed to come in for a fly-in day on Capitol Hill. They flew to DC, and during their flight, their wheelchair was damaged on the plane. They spent the entire fly-in in their hotel room, and when they went to travel to the next location, their wheelchair had been repaired, and it was damaged on their next flight. I mean, this is really unacceptable, and these are issues that need to be addressed, and that's where the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act comes in. So for one thing, it would require the Department of Transportation to assess civil penalties against airlines for violations of the Air Carrier Access Act. It would also establish a private right of action for individuals with disabilities whose rights are violated during air travel. Additionally, it would require the Access Board to develop improved accessibility standards for new commercial aircraft to make sure that they are accessible, and even require the Access Board to issue accessibility standards for the removal of some access barriers on existing aircraft. So we think this bill would help make air travel a lot more accessible, and obviously there are a lot of things that need to be addressed in air travel, but these are really some much needed improvements. So we are hoping to build more support for that bill. The last bill that I want to talk about, the Congressman's actually going to introduce this Friday. It's called the Ready for Disasters Act. Its full title is actually the Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion for Disasters Act. And this bill is about disaster management. See, right now, it's a widely known fact that disasters are increasing in both intensity and frequency. And as this happens, people with disabilities and vulnerable populations in general are becoming increasingly threatened by these disasters. And what we really need to make sure of is that before, during, and after disasters, the needs of people with disabilities and seniors cannot be forgotten. And that's really where the Ready for Disasters Act comes into play. It does several things. It takes a multi-angled approach to this. So for one thing, it would modify an already existing committee, the National Advisory Committee on Individuals with Disabilities and Disasters, to make sure that this committee accurately reflects the diverse characteristics of the disability community. We feel very strongly that for this committee to provide proper advice, and there needs to be seats at the table for the people impacted. This bill would also establish a national network of centers across all the FEMA regions that would be focused on training, technical assistance, and research to better support people with disabilities during disasters. Additionally, it would do several things to look at the way disaster response has been in the past. So for one thing, and we can learn from the past, we can learn from our mistakes. So for one thing, it directs the Government Accountability Office to review previous uses of disaster funds and make sure they've been spent in accordance with the Rehabilitation Act as well as the ADA. It would also require the Department of Justice to examine the extent to which the civil rights of people with disabilities have been upheld during and after previous disasters. And again, it's so important that we examine how these things have gone, because we need to learn from our mistakes and know where we need to be better. So I'm also very happy to share that this bill is bipartisan, and the bill's co-leads are Congressman Chris Smith, a Republican from New Jersey, as well as Congressman Albio Sires, a Democrat from New Jersey, and Congressman Jimmy Panetta, who's a Democrat from California. And in the Senate, we are proud to have Senator Bob Casey leading the charge. And Senator Casey, it's my understanding, has several original co-sponsors for this bill as well. So on the House side, we're going to introduce this on Friday. And on the Senate side, they're actually going to introduce it on Thursday. So we're excited to start building support for this bill and to advance this. and see how far we can go, because we need to get this over the finish line. And with that in mind, I'm just going to say that if these bills sound interesting to you, any of them, and if you, like I believe, and like Congressman Langevin believes, that these bills would help make people's lives better, I really encourage you to contact your representatives and your senators' offices and ask them for their support. Let them know the importance of these bills, the importance of what they stand for, and let them know that you support them. Because the more support we can get, the more likely we are to advance these to the finish line. So with that in mind, I'll just say one more thing, and I unfortunately can't stick around for the Q&A, but if anyone has questions, I really encourage you to please put them in the chat. And Erin, if you could please forward them to me, that would be great. I would be happy to get back to people after the event. So thank you, everyone. And I'm now going to turn it over to Kim Musheno, who is a co-chair of the CCD Task Force on Developmental Disabilities, Autism, and Family Supports. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Alec. I'm so pleased to be here. My name is Kim Musheno from the Autism Society of America. And I'm really pleased to be here and wish I could see everyone, because one of my first disability policy jobs was with the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities back in the early 90s. So it's good to be back here with you all, and to be on this panel with champions of such champions that we have with Representative Scott and Langevin and Senator Murray. They are truly champions for people with disabilities, and we are so pleased with all the work that they and their staff are doing on our behalf. So I was asked to talk a little bit about our coalition. Erin and I co-chair, along with a few other advocates, the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, Developmental Disabilities, Autism, Family Support, and Child Abuse Task Force. We are just one task force of about 15 within CCD. CCD is a coalition of over 100 national disability organizations with the mission of providing supports and services for people with disabilities in the community. So we divide all of our policy work among these task forces. So the Developmental Disabilities Task Force works primarily on several pieces of legislation, but including the Developmental Disabilities Act, the Autism Cares Act, the Lifespan Respite Care Act, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, and of course the appropriations or funding bills that support all of these. And then we also participate in and monitor other legislation that impact our IDD population. And then we work together with other task forces on other legislation, such as education, health, employment, long-term services and supports, and so on. Right now, we, as everybody has been speaking about COVID, COVID did take a lot of our energy, and we had to shift gears to support the people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities and their families during the pandemic. So we our coalition worked on every COVID relief package. At first we were really concentrating on mitigation measures, getting personal protective equipment to group homes and other places that people with disabilities and their families live. We were focusing on making sure that people got access to COVID tests, and especially with accommodations. And now that we have 3 approved vaccines, we are trying very hard to make sure that people with disabilities have a right to get the vaccine, the accessibility needs are met, and we're trying to get information out to everybody about the vaccines and vaccine safety. In the relief packages, we also worked very hard to get other supports and services, especially home and community-based services and supports, because as we found out throughout the pandemic, congregate settings were not safe places to be, and many people were wanting to move out into their own homes or smaller group settings, and so we pushed very hard for increases in home and community-based services and supports. As you all know by now, we were successful finally in the most recently passed American Rescue Plan. We got an FMAP, temporary FMAP, federal Medicaid matching grant in the American Rescue Plan, and we were very pleased about that. We were also successful in getting money for additional funding for special education services and related services, acknowledging how difficult it has been for students with disabilities and their families trying to learn from home and do without many related services. So we're pleased that we successfully advocated for money in the the American Rescue Plan, and then other things like paid leave and making sure that adult dependents were included in the stimulus funds. We were very happy to be to get a lot of those things into the American Rescue Plan. So now we're turning towards the next infrastructure plans, and of course we're working on appropriations, and our previous speakers spoke about the success we were able to achieve in some of the appropriations bills. So we continue to work on that because it's passed the House, but now we have to work on the Senate side. And then in the infrastructure plans, as I think Amanda mentioned, and also Phoebe, they're working on a 2-track plan. There's an infrastructure plan that is mainly focused on things like roads and bridges, but also broadband. But we're really interested in the next infrastructure plan that we call the care infrastructure, and that is a 3.5 trillion package that includes a lot of the President Biden's concepts that were in the Build Back Better agenda. Our previous speakers spoke about the Better Care, Better Jobs Act. That's one of the pieces of legislation that we hope will be included in this next infrastructure plan. That's the one that provides the $400 billion, which is, like Phoebe said, an historic amount of funding for home and community-based services through Medicaid. And if we can get this passed, it will significantly reduce the waiting list, which is almost a million people. 825,000 is what they're saying the wait list is nationwide, but we know that that's an undercount. So this will be a first step in making sure that the waiting list is reduced, and this will be through a 10% federal matching rate increase, and we hope that is long-term or permanent. This bill would also provide a 2% FMAP increase for states that improve their self-directed services, and that is really important for self-determination. There's an independent report that suggests that if this bill passes, 3.2 million people will be eligible for home and community-based services, and 1.1 million family caregivers would be able to go back to work. So this would really help our economy overall and help build jobs. And so we're the Autism DD Family Support Task Force is working in conjunction with the Long-Term Services and Supports and Health Task Force on this major piece of legislation. I should mention this bill will also include rental assistance, housing vouchers, nutrition assistance, and a lot of other things that will help people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So all of our separate task forces are working on all the separate pieces that will be in this next infrastructure plan, which you might also hear as the budget reconciliation. And the reason it's going through reconciliation is because if it goes through this budget mechanism, then it requires a simple majority in the Senate instead of the 60 votes to overcome any kind of filibuster. And this will make it easier to pass. But we need your help. We have at the Autism Society of America, we have an online action center. I know NACDD also put out an action alert because this isn't going to happen unless everybody tells their members of Congress to support it. We're especially focusing on the Senate, where we need to have at least 50% of the senators to be supporting it. And we know there's 40 co-sponsors now, but we need more. We need at least 50 co-sponsors of the Better Care, Better Jobs Act to make sure that that gets included in this reconciliation package. So that's what we're hyper focused on at the moment, along with the appropriations. And so just a little bit how our task force works. So we meet monthly and we strategize. And the nice thing about that is that we can share resources. Not one of us could do any of this alone. So we work together as a task force, and that really helps us. We divide and conquer, as the saying goes. So we work with Phoebe in Representative Scott's office very frequently, and Senator Murray's staff and Representative Langevin, and lots of other champions on the Hill. On the HCBS front, Senator Casey has been taking a lead, Senator Casey from Pennsylvania, and Representative Dingell from Michigan, very important champions. So we need to make more champions, and we definitely need your help and hope that you are following Erin's instructions on how to contact your members of Congress, and please continue to educate them about the needs of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because you are the experts. And I'm happy to stay around for any questions. Thank you, Erin and all.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Kim, Phoebe, Nicole, wait, who else did we have on here? Amanda, Alec. As is pretty typical in Washington, some of our congressional staff have had to drop off, but we're pleased to have Phoebe and Kim here, and of course Nicole as well, to answer any questions you might have about moving forward in this new Congress. What change can we expect? How will this impact your lives? I really would encourage you to use the chat box questions to ask us any questions. These don't need to be, super technical questions. It could be a question about, does it really, how is Congress going to help my situation? I have friends in institutional settings. How will this Congress help? But think creatively. We're lucky to have some time left here, so you can have all of your questions answered. To get us started, though, I thought I would call upon Nicole, our resident expert, to see if she could start us off with a question for Phoebe and Kim.
How optimistic are you that there will be real change for people with disabilities in this Congress? Like, friends, especially on things like HCBS. It would be nice to see states expand HCBS, especially for adults with autism without intellectual disability.
I mean, I'll jump in and start. I'm as folks know, I tend to be a little bit of a pessimist. So I guess hopefully you'll find this encouraging that I am actually optimistic right now. I think that the level of understanding of the need is something I've never seen before. I think that people really are really starting to understand, and congressmen are starting to understand. Congresspeople are starting to understand the importance of home and community-based services. They're starting to understand the critical role that direct support professionals, PCAs, whatever you want to call them, provide in the lives of people with disabilities and older folks. And so I think that there is hope for real change. I think that we've all been through a really tough year, and I think unfortunately, some of the stories about how difficult it's been for people with disabilities, have resonated, and people have an understanding that I don't know that they've had before. So I'm optimistic.
And this is Erin. I wanted to jump in just really quickly too. I don't know how many of you are watching the Olympics, but I am. And I remember watching the softball team, and there was the first half of the inning where maybe the other team would score a run, and then it would be our turn up to bat, right? Or the United States turn up to bat, whatever team you're cheering for. I really feel that, as Phoebe said, for the first time in quite a while, I'm talking to members of Congress and staff who are starting to understand this issue at a much deeper and more meaningful level. And that is really encouraging. And quite frankly, the result of tons of activism by all of you on the phone. And like I said, the big changes in the air, right? The situation that COVID brought to light, and tragically, and the elections have consequences. But even so, the level of staffing that are being promoted, these are actual experts. Phoebe herself, she's being very, very modest about the role that she played in the protection and advocacy networks, coming up. So we have a lot of people who are up to bat for us. And I'm feeling optimistic on HCBS as well. In fact, that's already been a win. Congress has already given that temporary bump to the services that your states can provide. And I'd encourage all of you to remember that just because Congress is providing funding for this money doesn't mean your states have to take up the money. So if you stick around for the breakout session later this afternoon, you'll hear from a bunch of our experts on how you can advocate to make sure that this extra money going to your states actually goes for services that you need and that you can use. We did have a question from the chat box. Actually, a couple. Let's tick off some of those. Kevin Nunez, thank you, Kevin, wanted to ask, where can we learn more about Abilities One and apprenticeships? Kim or Phoebe, do you want to talk a little bit about what Abilities One is and kind of what the federal role is with the apprenticeship programs? Either of you feel like you could take that?
You could start, Phoebe.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, gosh, you'd think I would know better after a year and a half of this. I'm sorry, everyone. Yes. So I did work on the National Apprenticeship Act, and I think we made some improvements to the way that apprenticeships are accessible to people with disabilities, and to make sure that people with disabilities, would truly have meaningful opportunities to participate in apprenticeships. I myself actually went to Northeastern University Law School, and their whole focus of their program is a co-op program where people are able to go out and experience working while they're in law school. And for me personally, as a person with a disability who I lived on Social Security prior to going to law school, and really didn't have much of a work history, partly because of that, and because I was focused on studies. For me, the apprenticeship program opportunity that I was offered through Northeastern was really critical. And so that really has kept me very much aware of how important that can be for people with disabilities in terms of building a work history, in terms of, developing those soft skills, in terms of developing a network of people that, can recommend you for future employment. So those are opportunities that are really important for people with disabilities, and we're very focused on making sure that people with disabilities have opportunities to meaningfully participate in them.
Thanks, Phoebe. Another really great inside the Beltway question comes from Robert Lawhead, who's a policy expert in our network. And Bob asks a question that we've mentioned several times, the need for fully funding the $400 billion increase in HCBS within the reconciliation bill. And they're doing their best to contact their congressional delegations. Some legislators, they hear other legislators are proposing reducing the $40 billion to a lesser amount. Has there been any analysis or impact of these lesser amounts on the administration's vision for HCBS? I will kick it off to say, I will try to go back and find the administration put out and it might have been a congressional committee, put out a really great fact sheet on what states would benefit if this $400 billion HCBS, Home and Community-Based Services funds were given. How much money could states benefit? So clearly there is a direct analysis on those amounts, and that is something that you should take into consideration when you go to your delegations. I think, has there been and to Phoebe and Kim, I don't think there's been an analysis on how much the lesser amounts would be, but it would be lesser. And so what we were talking about and kind of how I feel like it's our turn up to bat, Congress has this limited time to make these changes in the air, but it's only going to be until the next congressional election, which is a year from November, right? So we've got one more year to get this done. So the question becomes, can we do this in an incremental fashion, or will we lose our momentum as as priorities change, as we move further out, hopefully, of this COVID pandemic? So that I hope that's a good partly answer. Did you want to add anything, Nicole or Kim?
Yeah, I can go. We all know that the 400 billion is not even enough. We think this is a step in the right direction to build the infrastructure of care for those in the community. It's been neglected for far too long, and this legislation is just a first step. We hope that after we get this passed, we will be working on the HCBS Access Act. That is a draft bill that would flip on its head the institutional bias in Medicaid and make sure that people.
HCBS is mandatory.
Yep.
An entitlement, right? Because right now it's an entitlement, to live in an institution but not live in your own home.
Yes.
And getting rid of wait list would also, may help alleviate some of the concern people have with closing segregated settings. And when we look at the direct support professional workforce, the time is now to make the DSP workforce a livable wage. Like recently I heard from somebody in Vermont how, they're having trouble finding staff, and staff are making more at McDonald's. That should not happen with this profession.
Yeah. So the 400 billion, there was some discussion that, there's so many priorities and there's only one pie. So I can understand that there's a lot of pressure and also they want to keep it at a certain top line number. If senators don't want to take the ideas for ways to pay for this, then there's going to be cuts. We really have to put some pressure on our senators to accept some of the revenue raisers that are being proposed, so that this doesn't get whittled down to something that is not meaningful. So there was a little worry a week or so ago, and we all put out action alerts saying, please contact your members of Congress not to negotiate this down to an amount that's wouldn't make meaningful change.
And now more than ever, we need to increase HCBS and expand the social safety net for people with disabilities, because long term, COVID is going to lead to more people with disabilities. When we look at all these long haulers, just like in the 50s, SSDI came out of Eisenhower when we had polio and that HN3-2 flu pandemic. It was smaller than this.
Yeah, but at least we know that our champions, Representative Bobby Scott and Senator Casey and Senator Brown and Duckworth and Representative Dingell, they are really committed to making sure that the full $400 billion is included.
And speaking of Bobby Scott, we have some, I love the questions coming into the chat. Everyone, please continue to submit your questions. But we've got a really good one on voting rights. We didn't get a chance to talk about that specifically today. But again, later this afternoon, there will be a breakout session on voting rights and disability. So please be prepared for that if you're interested. But Alicia Murray asks, she says that she works really well with the City Council to communicate with them and others when it comes to disability needs. What's the best way to present that voting accessibility for the disability community or anything relating to voting and disability to the City Council? FYI, I am friends with the mayor on Facebook. Let me just start with saying that you've already done the number one step, which is power mapping your influence, right? So you know exactly who you have a direct line to, so congratulations. Nicole, did you want to mention anything about voting rights, or Phoebe or Kim?
Well, when it comes to voting rights, it's important that, we, not have voter ID laws, especially being, there's, and I know, many places like Vermont. One time I went to a self-office group and just about everybody there didn't have an ID. Voter ID laws are going to cause challenges for people with disabilities. And we need access to voting by mail. We need to make the mail reliable. A functioning post office is not a partisan issue. And neither should saving democracy.
Yes, I'm very concerned about the state legislation that is being proposed to limit the ways people can vote, and that I believe that will really hurt people with disabilities who rely on vote by mail in other ways to extended days and things like that to have their rights to vote. So I'm very concerned about that. I'm glad you're having a separate session on that. And I think your caller or your questioner, I agree. She's doing the right thing, and I encourage everyone to work at the local, state, and national levels to voice your concerns about the limits to voting rights.
Yeah, I just to echo that. I mean, I hear, from Mr. Scott all the time that he's heard from constituents, and that's who he really listens to. And I think that's true of almost all representatives. And so, definitely forming those kind of relationships and making sure that you're the squeaky wheel helps a lot, and especially in something as important as Kim said as voting rights, because without the right, to have your voice in government, none of these priorities are going to be elevated. So we have to, that has to be job one, is maintaining access to the vote.
Alicia, I did want to tell you that NACDD has worked in partnership for a few years to create the onevotenow.org resource for you. And so I think Robin will put something in the chat box, but we do work with disability partners in all the states and territories on voting rights. As you know, a lot of the states are the ones that control most of the voting rules and when they have elections and things like that. But the federal government does get involved when it comes to constitutional rights and obstructions to voting. And there are several pieces of legislation we're working on. But for advocates in the state, I really encourage you to check out the One Vote Now, because it will go through some basic steps that you can take to educate your state and local officials. Okay, this is great. Thank you. This one is another great question from Santa Perez from Nevada, another amazing advocate and friend. Her question is, oi, yeah, 14C is such a challenge. Yeah, I imagine, especially in Nevada. How are you going to change parents' minds? And once again, fortunately, we have a breakout session after our break on 14C, where we'll be looking at 3 states, Maryland, Colorado, and Hawaii, and how they've been working on state legislation to eliminate 14C. But I think Santa's question goes much deeper into, why is it such a challenge to pass this 14C legislation, Phoebe? Why can't we just pass Transformation to Competitive Employment Act? Oh, sorry, Competitive and Integrated Employment Act.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and actually, right before this call, I was on a call with a bunch of folks who mostly support 14C. And so I guess my comment on that would be to just continue to engage. And I think, we have to, we have to understand that a lot of these parents that are trying to defend 14C, I think we have to sort of meet them where they are and give them credit for, they are operating from a place of real care and real concern. But we need to make sure that we continue to talk about the importance of, fair wages as a civil rights issue. We need to continue to talk about the opportunities for competitive integrated employment and the fact that we're not abandoning anyone. The Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Bill has significant resources that are devoted to providing opportunities for supported employment, customized employment, job discovery, all the things that we know work to help people with disabilities engage in competitive integrated employment, and also wraparound services so that they have, opportunities to engage with the community, even if it's not in an employment setting, and that's equally important. So I just think we have to continue to keep engaging, and ultimately, we're talking about 90,000 people, I think, now who are engaged in 14C employment, and that is so much less than just a couple of years ago when we were talking about 400,000 people. So the tide is turning, and I just think we have to continue to stay engaged.
And I saw Nicole texting me. Nicole, I know you feel very strongly about this. Did you have any comments about why is it taking so long?
When we say CIE, competitive, we don't mean everybody, moving out instead of working 40 hours. And, and when it also comes to states, look at states like Vermont that have done transformations and closing shelter workshops and moving into integrated settings. Show people how much they can earn over 10 years if they're worried about the SSI or what have you.
I would add to what Nicole said.
And check out my book on Disability Employment Policy 101.
Oh, good idea. I would add that the home and community-based service funding is really going to help with this. As Phoebe mentioned, it's the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act provides for, first of all, it provides for money to transform the system over time, so that people aren't, so it's not just a cutoff. And included in that are wraparound services. There's an understanding, a true understanding from Representative Scott and Senator Casey and others working on this. They are very concerned and do not want people to fall through the cracks. So they're doing everything that they can to make sure that this goes smoothly. And I think that the transformation bill is constructed very wisely. And states, even if all states are not eligible for these competitive grants, it will go on, and so that eventually every state will hopefully get one. And meanwhile, there'll be a technical assistance center to help all states. And so we don't have that right now. We don't have a place where states can go and get technical assistance to do the transformation that they need to do. I live in Maryland, and we have already eliminated 14C certificates, and we're successfully. It's not always easy, but we're successfully transitioning folks to competitive integrated employment. Phoebe, you might want to tell folks about the hearing that was just held on the House side. There were two individuals who had transitioned to competitive integrated employment. I thought they did such a great job explaining how that happened.
Sure. Yeah, and it was a great story from both of them. Again, we did have a hearing on we had one on direct care one day, and then the next day we had a hearing on 14C. So both of these issues are very important on the committee, and we're trying to elevate them. And we did hear from John Anton, who is transitioned from doing sheltered work to working in competitive integrated employment, and also Nancy, who talked about her daughter, who actually was never in a sheltered workshop because basically when she was graduating from high school, they were sort of trying to route her towards 14C employment. And she said, no, this is not for me, and has been very successfully working at Costco for a number of years. So really great to hear their stories, and also heard from Neil Lewis with the National Federation of the Blind, who had a very powerful story about the impact of 14C within his own family and his own sort of history. And so I think, I don't know, it's always chipping away with 14C, because I think it's one of those issues where people are very strongly entrenched into their positions. But I have gotten a few people who have wanted to sign on to the bill since that hearing. So I take some encouragement from that.
Oh, good.
But I hate to say this, y'all. I do have to jump. I have another thing that started at 3:15 that I have to jump for. So thank you so much for your time. If anybody has any questions, feel free to forward them, and I'll be happy to engage further.
We certainly will, Phoebe, and thank you for being so generous with your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye, y'all.
Bye. So we do have a couple more questions in the chat box, which, again, I'm so grateful to Kim Musheno and Nicole LeBlanc for being here, as is always often the case with congressional staff. We do have to work around their time a little. I think these are important questions, so I'm hoping that Nicole, maybe you can take a crack at this one. Ryan Duncanwood asked a question. He said he has a question about non-self-determination services and audit camping. I'm not familiar with the phrase audit camping, but I am familiar with the need for self-determination and services and supports that can help people live their fullest lives. Nicole, did you want to say, I know you've done a lot of work on self-determination. Do you want to say a few things about that?
Referencing self-direction? Is he referencing self-audit? Is he referencing self-directed services?
I'm sorry. Someone just said adult camping, not audit camping, adult camping.
I don't know what that is. Like, are you talking special summer camps?
Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about self-determination and why is that, and the work that's being done in that area to make sure that people with IDD are having opportunities to live in the community.
Like in this, like self-direction is definitely one area that's, a good time to expand, especially when you look at some stuff that's come out showing that people have lower risk when it comes to COVID risks with self-direction versus other models.
I think that that's a really good point. And,
as Bradley just wrote a book on self-direction.
Right.
You can find on Amazon.
Well, Senator Casey, in putting together the Better Care, Better Jobs Act, also thinks that self-direction is very important, which is one of the reasons why there's a 2% proposal to have a 2% increase for states that work to improve their self-directed services and supports.
There's no better time to expand self-direction than the present. And also promote it, promote options counseling. Quite often when people get services, they're not even told that they can self-direct.
Right.
Yeah, there's always intersection here with self-direction, and every single issue that we work on, keeping everything person-centered is often a challenge for lawmakers, as it is for parents and other people too. But that's something that we have to break through. And I still think that if we could get rid of that institutional bias in Medicaid, that would be really helpful. I know that a lot of people get trapped into guardianships and other situations just because that's the way things are done in their state. I know there's a lot of work at the state level on that issue. And I wish Phoebe was still on the phone because, darn it, that was one of Phoebe's big cases when she started at the PNA, was working on getting someone out of a guardianship situation, and because it was not appropriate. And as we heard yesterday, that Kurt Decker from the National Disability Rights Network, where Amanda used to work, is going to be working with Paris Hilton to talk a little bit more about how people get trapped into, institutional settings and other places that take away their rights, and how important it is for people to know that.
I mean, when it comes to guardianship, some parents have that myth out there that, okay, if I need to get a guardian if I want to talk to my son or daughter's healthcare provider.
Right. Well, and then we have one more set of questions that goes to, I believe, a real structural and systemic problem in Congress that we need to change. And that is the role of Congress in addressing the needs of people with disabilities in the District of Columbia and the U.S. territories in Puerto Rico. Jermaine Altira asked, given the fact that territory representatives and delegates don't have a floor vote Congress, what are some ways we can be more effective in pushing through legislation that would benefit their respective jurisdiction? And then Carol Grigsby, an amazing advocate from the NACDD Council, says, since DC has no meaningful legislative representation, please also make DC statehood part of your advocacy for voting rights. And Carol, I can tell you, yes, we do. And we are aware of Miss Norton's, Congresswoman Norton's, she's constantly pushing that. When we talk about voting rights, we constantly have to have DDC on that platform. And we do have a position at NACDD in support of statehood. And Jermaine, yeah, you're right. That's one of the big things that we're talking about, right? Kim and Nicole, do you have any background or ideas on how people, first of all, do you feel that representation in Congress is really a disability issue? Because self-determination is so far at the heart of the movement. Nothing about us without us. It just seems to me that this would be an issue that would be close to our heart. Do you agree?
Yeah, and it needs to be essential, especially, when we look at, the long-term impact of this pandemic. Now's the time to make a society more accessible. If we all live long enough, we'll all join the disability club.
That's right.
Yeah, I think the representatives in DC and Puerto Rico and so on need to be in coalition with their colleagues, and it's so unfortunate, but it's true. It's hard to get the support, but they have to get in coalition with others to gain others' support. But it's really discrimination.
Well, thank you.
Essential.
Kim and Nicole, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make?
Yeah, I'd like to close with what we started out talking about, and that is, do we feel hopeful about the Build Back Better campaign? And I do. I really feel like we have some champions, and we have the right time. But we have to do it now. We have time, but it's short. Mm-hmm. So we all have to work very hard over the next 3 weeks. But I do feel hopeful. I don't know if all of you watched, the joint session address by the president and vice president. They always talk about people with disabilities within their Build Back Better campaign, and more than like any previous administration, I think. So that we really are important to them, and I think that the Congress is our champions in Congress are taking that up, and they're really working hard. We are fortunate to have some very strong champions right now. Just please help us work right now over the next 3 to 4 weeks, and continue to educate your members of Congress. I know it's hard right now with all the distance and having to, do this all on the phone or by Zoom, but in some cases, that's making it more possible. You can still meet with your member of Congress or their staff via Zoom, whether in their district office or in their federal office. So I just would encourage you, just because we can't meet in person, we can't have press conferences, we can't have rallies, we can still make our voices heard.
Thank you, Kim. And you just answered Paul Palmer, who said, has anyone talked to Congresswoman Slotkin about the direct service worker legislation? So, Paul, you can go ahead and call her yourself on the congressional switch line, or find their email address, or send me an email, and I will get you the email for the person you should talk to in that office. Nicole, did you have any closing remarks?
It's now to seize the moment, so we come out stronger after this nightmare. As you know, as this pandemic is showing, climate change and disability are not partisan issues. It will impact you one way or another.
I think that's a great way to end the conversation.
Make America less stressed and free our people.
Well, I'm so honored to be joined by Kim, by you, and Nicole. Thank you so much for your remarks today. And well, that concludes our panel session for today. I want to remind everyone that we're going into a short break, and we'll be back around 4 o'clock for the amazing breakout sessions that are going to drill even deeper into some of the issues we've been talking about. Most importantly, these breakout sessions are being led by DD Council members themselves, who are experts in state law, figuring out ways to translate what we're doing here in Congress and make it work in your state. And conversely, how to bring ideas from your state and share them with other states so we can advance issues. The 4 topics that you need to choose from. The first is a 3-council strategy for eliminating subminimum wage. That's the 14C issue in Maryland, as Kim talked about, Colorado and Hawaii, all at different stages of getting rid of subminimum wages. The second, statewide success on leveraging federal funds for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities in New Jersey. This is a fascinating case study about how New Jersey advocates went through their own state systems to get American Recovery Act funding specifically targeted for interventions for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's a great masterclass in state how to work the state legislature for needed funds that are coming through all of these COVID bills. The other one is voting rights and accessibility, how the disability community is moving towards change. We have a ton of interest in that, especially as the panelists mentioned, Phoebe in particular, about our concern over state laws that are limiting access to the polls. And then the final breakout session, state strategies to protect and expand home and community-based services in the wake of COVID-19. Now, I know you're saying that sounds kind of wonky, which means kind of confusing. It's not. It's about how you work at your state level to make sure that the Medicaid money that they're getting is actually going to services that you need and not to, services that you don't. How many of you have received additional telehealth services this year? Do you want to see that continued after COVID? These are the kind of discussions that breakout session will be having. So I encourage you to choose wisely. Somebody asked if these sessions are being recorded. Yes, they are. So you will have access to them afterwards. And I guess that's all I have for now. So again, thank you to all our wonderful panelists, and thank you everyone in NACDD family for joining. We look forward to coming back here at 4 o'clock to pick one of your breakout sessions. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.